James, you ready?
I am ready.
All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started here. I'm going to drink some water and then see if I can make this little clicker function the way it's
Just
supposed to
a
function.
quick shout out for Alex of LSC. He wanted me to say hi to you, Sean, as well, and thanks for giving him a simple plug yesterday on the evidence management or the tracker webinar yesterday. So I know there's a lot of folks that are struggling, especially here in California, since our steel mill has gone out of business. So we have nowhere to take our guns for destruction. So LSC does the work for you by selling the parts and destroying the rest of it.
Well, that's one of the things we won't get to talk about here, but that's one of the reasons why it's so great to have state associations and groups of people and like the community forum on Facebook. I'll go ahead and make a plug for that now. You can find resources for questions. California,
Absolutely.
they can't destroy their guns because the one smelter that would destroy guns went the way of the dinosaur. In Texas,
that's correct.
You know, if you're in the Texas area, we all basically went to the same EPA approved incinerator facility, and they lost a part, or they had a part. I mean, so we were down for like a year, couldn't burn for a year.
Wow.
And so those things impact everyone, but it's great if you have a resource or can find a resource, share it with everyone. And the Facebook forum is intended for that. If you're not a member of that particular page, I even created a new Facebook profile. I'm pretty vehemently anti-Facebook in my personal life, but I felt like it was an important resource and a useful tool, so I created one. I have one friend, and I think it might, I don't know who it is, but that's okay with me.
Zuckerberg.
Yeah, it's mainly just to get out there and make that connection and build community. That's what it's for. So we're going to go ahead and get started here with and that ain't working. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. If you are here today, this is session 4 out of 5 sessions. Today we're going to talk about evidence storage and organization. We're also going to talk about evidence disposition. I've got a feeling that there are going to be a lot of questions, especially about evidence disposition, and we will stay on after the training session to answer those questions as best we can. So keep that in mind. We're going to go over the basic principles. I mean, this is a 7-session training class, a basic evidence management training class that we're trying to condense normal training class time into 7 online sessions. So it's a lot of information. I also want to kind of give a shout out or give a plug to Tracker Products. This is a free online training, but free is never free. It costs somebody something. And because of our partnership with Tracker Products, we've been able to put on this training. If you'd like to visit or learn more about their products, I would visit them at www.trackerproducts.com. They do evidence management software. So if you're looking at or want to learn more about evidence management software, give them a look at the URL at the bottom of your screen. We're going to make a few plugs. This is going to be like an NPR pledge drive right now. But one of the things that we've mentioned early in class was the need for local associations. I know that James has a lot of California people on the line. There are a lot of people here from different states and different regions. But there is no replacement for local organizations getting together and solving problems and being a resource for one another at the state level. I believe in that so much that we're working on an initiative this year to start 20 new evidence associations across the United States. We don't want to be in your association. We don't want to control it. We want to help you get funded, get set up, get filed legally with the state and filed legally with the IRS as a 501c3. We will walk you through the process. I'm really excited. Next week, I'm going to meet with some folks in Minnesota who are rekindling an association there. And we've got interest in Oklahoma. So if you're at another state, you have no representation, please contact me. Would love to talk with people in your state. It doesn't take a lot of people to make a huge impact on operations in your state.
Especially Hawaii. Have we had any interest in Hawaii at this point?
I'm really hoping that the people of Fiji will unite behind the banner of evidence management, any tropical location, I will make this pledge today. I will come to you, tropical location, and help you set up. It means that much to me. Another thing I want to talk about, and we'll discuss this more next week, is just kind of a preview. We're doing this Thursday at 2 o'clock Central training session. It's 7 sessions. You don't have to come back for more, but I think this time spot has been valuable and people are able to
Yeah.
get away. So we're going to continue this, and we're going to dive deeper into very specific evidence topics and devote an entire hour to something that we might only be able to gloss over in an instant here on
Yeah.
this training class. And we'll have guests and we'll have different resources available to you. So that's the evidence show. It premieres June 11th, 2020 at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard. There is more to come. So just know that that's in the works. But
Absolutely.
today, we're going to talk evidence storage and organization. We're going to talk evidence disposition. And at the end of class, we're going to do questions and answers to help you kind of understand more, because there will be gaps, there will be questions, and there will be things that are specific to you and your state that we would like to help you with if we're able to. So again, the notes of the class, if you're late joining, notes of the class are available at the handouts section of this. We've also posted on our website, or on the client page of our website. You can download them from there. I didn't post them to the Facebook community forum. So if you're looking for them there, I've been remiss in that, but you can find them at a little link right there. Just click on it. And I'm going to point to it again as if you can see what I'm pointing at. So
Oh,
this
thanks
is
a lot, Sean.
James. Yes, it's a
Thanks
much
for
younger
sneaking that
version.
picture in. Oh
Yeah,
my God.
that was yeah,
That's my
it's a
death
mug
photo.
shot. And
That's called the death photo. When you get hired on with the agency, they take that picture in case something happens to you and you have to put your picture on the news.
really, that is that is
Very morbid, right?
that is very morbid. Well, the photo of me, that's actually the woman I am still married to 27 years later. That
Awesome.
is from a Sadie Hawkins dance in 8th grade. And the reason I post that picture is because I'm still angry. My mom made me wear a tie and a collared shirt. And I think anyone that was alive during that era would know that the appropriate thing to wear under a loosely constructed pink jacket is a t-shirt, just like Don Johnson from Miami Vice. But my mom wouldn't do that. I'm still a little bitter. We'll talk about something else.
You're dating
Let's talk
yourself.
about, yes, let's talk about evidence storage and organization as the first topic.
Yes.
So want to run through a few definitions here just to kind of get us started. And they're all almost self-explanatory. When I'm talking about an organization system, I'm talking about all the patterns and the rules that govern how you file, store, and retrieve evidence. Your organization system is a holistic, overarching system that governs how you store evidence. A storage system is just a network of associated storage equipment. If you have a row of files or a row of shelves, that's a part of a storage system. Storage method is a little more granular. That's a filing cabinet, a storage shelf, a conveyor storage type device. Those we refer to as different storage methods. And I realized when I was going through the slide decks this week that I talk about something often, and I very rarely kind of explain what I mean. And that's the concept of the required duration of custody. Basically, when I say required duration of custody, that term just means the time from picking up the evidence or submitting the evidence to the evidence management unit until it's approved for disposal and actually disposed. We'll get more into that, but I realize that that's a topic that, or a phrase that I use often that I haven't really defined very well. And so when we talk about evidence storage, there are a couple of just ground rules or baseline facts that we want to establish early on. We believe and we teach that all evidence should be stored in a secure environment that supports the preservation of the item in as close to submitted condition as possible with an unbroken chain of custody. There are a couple of important factors there. Secure environment. preservation of the item in submitted condition, and unbroken chain of custody. Each of those factors is equally important, and they all play a part in evidence storage and evidence organization. So we believe in storing evidence under conditions that preserves the forensic integrity and original condition of the item. That's just a fundamental baseline principle of evidence management. We've taken it from you. We're going to give it back to you in original condition. Now, there are always going to be a few exceptions. Things are going to weather, things are going to age, but as close and as as far as it is possible for you as an agency, you want to preserve those items and return them to them in original condition, or return to the owner in original condition as much as it is legally and humanly possible. Obviously, there are exceptions. Black tar heroin, we're not going to return to the owner. Things that have to be treated chemically for forensic analysis might also not be preserved in original condition. But the original condition we're talking about is items that come in. You want them to go back to the owner in usable condition. We don't want to do anything that would further degrade that item during storage. So efficient evidence storage operations use organization and filing systems in concert with storage methods to maximize available facility space. Basically, we use the right kind of shelving and the right kind of organization patterns with the right equipment in order to achieve efficient operations for evidence storage. And we believe that efficient evidence storage operations facilitate the efficient retrieval of any evidence item in a timely manner. More about that in just a second. But let's talk for a little bit about worst practices. I had pictures that went along with this, but I ran out of time. So that would have been a fun stroll down memory lane. And James, if you want to add any of your pet peeves, but these are mine. When I look at evidence storage, these are the things that drive me crazy as an evidence manager and as a person that teaches evidence and does consulting work in property rooms. When I see these things, they drive me crazy. Stacking packages on top of other packages, always a bad idea. Overstuffing locations. I knew an unnamed property technician that I worked with, and this property technician would basically just walk to a shelf and just shove things onto the shelf, literally to the point where things would fall out on the other side of the shelf. And this person was so conditioned to just stuffing evidence in a location that that's the that's the only thing that mattered. Another thing that drives me nuts is seeing sedimentary rock storage formations. If you got a bin system and you just throw things in the bin, the things at the bottom of the box are ancient. The things at the top of the bin are usually newer. That is in my opinion, that's a terrible way to store evidence because it just creates this sedimentary-like formation, and it's very difficult to go back and retrieve evidence from those types of locations. We don't teach, nor do we believe in mixing evidence and non-evidence. It is very important that we keep evidentiary property separate from other types of property. If your agency stores equipment in your evidence room, that's something that we want to completely discourage. Even non-evidentiary property, stuff that legitimately belongs in the evidence room, we need to segregate from evidence for a couple of reasons. We'll get into them more as we talk about non-evidentiary property, but it's really important that evidence stays with evidence and it's not mixed with other item types or property types. That's a really bad practice to begin. Another thing that these are my personal opinions, but offsite storage, storing things in a van down by the river, those
Can't
usually
do that.
lack security. And by offsite storage, I mean, renting a storage unit where there's not 24/7 oversight by the agency, or a Conex box that's off property and offsite and not manned. There are some very specific use cases where that can be appropriate, but that has to be really locked down in policy and procedure, and locked down to non-evidentiary items of non-forensic value. It's really important that we're very careful when we deal with offsite storage, because it can be a catastrophe if it's handled inappropriately. Room temperature is one of my least favorite terms. We'll find out more here in just a little bit why. But room temperature in January in northern Alaska is cold. I mean, room temperature is the temperature of the room. The same way that room temperature in August in either hell or Texas is going to be hot. Uh, Room temperature doesn't mean anything. So we're going to talk more about storage, but storing things at room temperature we will find is not a great practice. You have anything, James? Any of your pet
Yeah,
peeves you want to add?
you know what? I know a lot of agencies do this, so this is not definitely not an attack on them. But from a physical standpoint, bicycles that we hang, see more people get hurt with hanging bicycles. Now I know that's a good practice in terms of storage, but you got to be real careful too, trying to pull those bikes down.
And that's a good point, and that's something that we probably need to add, or I need to add when we talk about facility safety. Is we have there are agencies that have these neat conveyors for bicycles, and if you've got safety equipment, it's kind of like having really tall shelves. If you've got really tall shelves, but you don't have a platform lift or a way to get up to those shelves or to bring that evidence down to you safely, then a good system can be bad because it is unsafe for employees. We're going to be talking about a lot of physical stuff here, but we'll definitely add that into the discussion when we talk about safety. So, organizing your evidence room. These are some best practices. The four things that we teach are limited locations, meaningful nomenclature, system maps, and clear labels. Um, by limited locations, I mean as few locations, as few places to put evidence as possible. And it's an economy of scale. There are other agencies that have great success doing it differently. I'm not saying this is the only way to do it. This is the way we teach because it works for 90% of evidence organizations or evidence agencies out there. In a big, huge agency like Orange County, limited locations might not work as well as they do in a smaller location. If you've got a staff of, 14 people working in Orange County, then this doesn't become as big of an issue. But for 90% of the agencies out there, limited storage locations make a huge difference in your ability to efficiently store evidence. At the agency I retired from, when I took over our evidence room, there were 600 or 800 different locations to store evidence, and we were a pretty small agency. That meant there were 600 or 800 places to lose something or to misfile something, and that just didn't work for us. I also like to see meaningful nomenclature. I've seen a lot of locations just labeled like S1, D1, 41, and if you're just looking for that, that doesn't mean anything. That doesn't speak to me. But I know drug cabinet or drug shelf or gun vault. Those things have meaning. So meaningful nomenclature. It's a great idea if your location means something that can be translated into the brain of another humanoid that is not in the room with you. Because if we leave tomorrow, we need to be able to reproduce. People still need to be able to locate that evidence. Beginning with meaningful nomenclature for location names is a great place to start. A system map is also an important piece of the puzzle here. When I talk about a system map, I mean a map of your property room that's laid out. I had a graphic, but let's just pretend that that little blank space on the side of your screen, that there's a beautiful graphic that's not there. Uh, a system map where this is your drug vault, this is your gun vault, this is your cold storage, this is your general evidence shelves, these are file cabinets, where everything's laid out to where somebody can literally take this map into your property room and find the location they're looking for. That also requires very clear labels of your property room. Now, some of these might not seem important, especially if you are a one person shop and you're the only person that goes back into that vault. The reason why it's important is not because of you or for you, it's for the people that come after you and for clarity and for having someone else come in. Uh, it's just basically for the person that comes after you. Or if you're in a shop where there's more than one person, so everybody's on the same page, so that everybody does things the same way. You need those four things in order to efficiently organize evidence. We teach, and I believe, and this is another thing, that it's kind of a scale thing. This might not work at at Orange County because y'all got a huge facility, and you've got some things up
Three,
on really. Go ahead.
three facilities. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the biggest issue that we have is transitory locations when things are in transit, going to and from the substations to court to the lab. So that's where you really have to reconcile each and every tote that you use to transport. Make sure that you've reconciliated that box once you've taken your items out or put them in. So very
Right.
critical.
Yeah. But ultimately, the time that you spend looking for a piece of evidence is wasted time. I mean, if you're in an evidence vault and it takes you 30 minutes to find a single piece of evidence, you multiply that 30 minutes times 50 or 60 or 70 or however many items you're trying to dispose of in a given day, month, week, or year, and you get time that you're never going to get back. It's utterly wasted time. So one of the principles that we teach is that evidence rooms should be organized so that any person could find any piece of evidence in under 5 minutes. Obviously, there are some caveats there. If you've got 3 facilities spread out over a county, this is not a hard and fast rule. This is just an organizational principle. And it's the principle of any piece. That means you want to have everything organized so that any person, that means anybody in the world not working in your unit, could be dropped in and find that thing under 5 minutes. That's a really helpful kind of benchmark to use for determining whether or not your system is organized in a manner that's efficient or sustainable. Can you find stuff quickly is a really important principle of evidence management. In order to do that, a 5 minute location, your organization system has to have some kind of map. It's got to be based on logic. Oh, that's a weird noise. Did you hear that?
It
That
did.
came from my nose and my mouth. We'll edit that out in post. It's got to be based on a logical system, and it's got to make sense the way you file things, whether it's CAD order or case order or year order or date order. There's got to be some logic to your system, and that logic needs to be spelled out so that everyone is working on the same sheet of music. And again, you'll see limited locations. And if you joined us last week for our packaging discussion, this is where limited packaging options come. This is where they become important. If you constrict packaging options to a few different packaging types, then you can have shelves and storage systems that are basically directly paired with the type of packaging that you use in agency. That really helps when you're locating evidence. It helps when you're filing evidence if you've got this clear, consistent pattern and packages that all conform to the same standard. It's just very helpful when you're organizing evidence. This is one of my favorite things to discuss, and I think it's probably, if you get nothing out of the class today with respect to storage, I would urge you to take a look at this document. It's the NIST Biological Evidence Preservation Handbook. It was published in 2013 by NIST. And the cool thing about this is this was a collaboration between evidence managers and evidence associations and lab directors and NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and the NIJ. They were all collaborative and working on this product because there were questions that were just unanswered out there. There was no consensus on some of these issues. And the Evidence Management Institute, we've written standards for basically every evidence operation or facet of evidence management that we can imagine. The one thing that we shied away from was biological evidence because they did such a masterful job with this biological evidence preservation handbook that we didn't need to write standards. The standards were already established and written, and they were done extremely well, and they answered almost all of the questions that you might have related to biological evidence. One of them is at what temperature should we store evidence? And that is answered for us in this preservation handbook. There are basically 4 different temperature types. There's frozen storage, and they actually define what frozen means. It's really important that we know what these things mean from a scientific basis because there are agencies out there that are using evidence freezers that might be freezing things at 25 degrees Fahrenheit or 11 degrees Celsius. And that is not a forensically appropriate storage environment if you really want to consider things frozen. Same with refrigerated. Refrigerated storage means thermostatically controlled between 36 degrees and 46 degrees with less than 25% humidity. And I will tell you, the Frigidaire that you bought from Best Buy isn't going to control humidity and temperature the same way that an evidence storage refrigerator will control temperature and humidity. It's important that we know that refrigerated storage means something very specific, that it means not just do we keep the temperature regulated, we also keep the humidity regulated. And it's the same thing for a temperature controlled environment. A temperature controlled environment is our baseline evidence storage environment, and that is basically between 60 degrees Fahrenheit and 75 degrees Fahrenheit with lower than 60% humidity. So one of the things that when I'm working with agencies and trying to help them maintain or obtain or create an appropriate storage environment, we want to always have our temperature set between 60 and 75. We always want to maintain lower than 60% humidity for the evidence types that we store. And then again, room temperature is basically the temperature inside the room. It's utterly meaningless. But you can find this information and more in the Biological Evidence Preservation Handbook. I couldn't recommend this enough. We've got a link on our website. You can Google NIST. You can Google the Biological Evidence Preservation Handbook or Alta Vista if you don't want to use Google. But that is available online to be downloaded at any time, and it is an incredible reference. If you've never read it, this is worth the price of admission. So,
Hey, Sean, can I just add one quick thing to the NIST handbook? There's a matrix in there that shows different types of most commonly booked evidence and the type of temperature that it requires. One thing that I would recommend, although that matrix is exceptionally close for pretty much 90% of the country, there are areas of the country that are have extreme temperatures and so forth. So the thing that really that we try to do is make sure you run it past your lab, have them check it off. They can even sign the bottom saying this date and time we read this and this is in line with how we would like to see it. So we had a humidity issue with that, and so we just modified one box in that matrix and away we went. But at least you know that's what your crime lab is wanting and having. So
absolutely, and that's an important thing to bring up. I mean, just because it's written in this book, I mean, this book is comprehensive, but you want to take your guidance on storage from the labs that you work with.
right.
That's an incredibly important piece of just baseline evidence operations. Is that ultimately we allow the crime lab, especially if you're working with a state or a municipal or a county crime lab, we allow them to govern storage conditions because they're testing these samples. They're going to testify to the analysis of these items. We want to store them in a way that they can support and back up. Documentation in each of these cases is critical. I think we can skip the rest of that slide. The default storage environment for most evidence types is, again, temperature controlled. If your evidence vault is a temperature controlled environment, 90% of the evidence that you need to store, you're going to be able to store appropriately if you control the temperature and humidity. If you don't, then that's going to create problems for you. Your biological evidence is going to degrade. Your metallic evidence is going to oxidize. Bad things can happen. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about the different storage methods that are out there. I love to talk storage options, and I'm working on one of the evidence show episodes will be about storage, and I think it will be riveting and fascinating. I'm hopeful that someone else will too, so that there would be someone to watch. But there are a lot of different options for you. I mean, there are different types of shelves, different types of filing cabinets and wall storage. A couple of things that I would point out for guns, money, and drugs, and we'll talk about this later. Those need to be stored under higher security conditions. Whether you achieve that through a separate room or a separate vault or a safe, there are a lot of different ways to achieve higher security, but those are things that you need to consider. Cold storage. What types of refrigerators and freezers do you use in your operation? Different rack storage or conveyor storage. If you store long guns, there are some rack systems out there that make evidence storage a breeze. I'll show you a few of them, but here are a couple things to keep in mind. Whatever your system is, whatever you use, it needs to be capable of storing all the evidence that you've got. If it doesn't, you need more space. If you don't have, or you need to get rid of stuff, which is usually the case. But it also needs to accommodate new evidence submission. We know that we're going to get more evidence in this year and then the next year and the year after that. So we want to basically create a storage system that is capable of expansion. I like to use an 80% capacity benchmark. If your evidence facility is at 80% of its capacity or less, then you've got a high degree of likelihood that you're going to be sustainable for future evidence storage. If you're over 80%, and I'll show you kind of mathematically here in when we talk about dispositions, if you're over 80% of capacity, then one case could overwhelm you and fill you up beyond capacity in a day. And I know that there are a lot of agencies that have experienced this. I mean, one homicide or one, it doesn't even have to be, a huge criminal case, a gambling case. Like if you were on the webinar yesterday where James did a tour of his facility, I mean, those gaming machines, how much space do they take up, James?
Oh my gosh, some of the gaming machines you can sit 8 people around the machine. So it's basically the size of I say like a twin or full size bed. And usually those are all taken under search warrant. So if they're taken under search, we got to hold them as long as the judge wants you to, and that's for us has been 5 years. So no evidentiary value in the fact that they're illegal. It's contraband. So, but we're not definitely not going to send them to auction or do they're going to be destroyed at the end of the case. So always a pain.
It's the 2020 equivalent of the grow light. I know if any
Right.
of you have been
Absolutely.
around, if you've been in evidence management for any length of time, uh, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, we had this huge affinity, especially in Texas, for seizing all the grow lights on a marijuana grow.
Yeah.
Uh, and our property room was full of grow lights. And in California, where they've basically legalized the production of marijuana, those grow lights are no longer able to hurt anyone. So storing them just doesn't make any sense. And it did make sense 20 years ago.
Yeah.
That's a soapbox. I'll move
Yeah,
on.
absolutely. Actually, we recycle those now. So actually, auction loves all that grow equipment. So
Yeah, I mean,
good stuff.
the best one is the one that never comes into your room. Uh, so one of the things I want to hit kind of early and often throughout the discussion of organization and evidence storage is that your evidence storage is directly impacted by your disposition rates. We don't need more space typically for most agencies, most municipalities. It's not a question of physical space. It's not a question of we need more of a footprint to store evidence. It's that we need to dispose of evidence more efficiently and more sustainably so that we can store the evidence that we need to keep and not store the evidence that we don't need to keep. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about your facility. Think about evidence disposition. Um, I'm going to go ahead and briefly touch on this, but basically, when you're looking at do I store it in a shelf? Do I store it in a filing cabinet? Choose the most efficient method for storing and retrieving your evidence. Sometimes it's going to be a shelf, sometimes it's going to be a filing cabinet, but you want to eliminate wasted space and maximize the storage capacity of your environment. You want to use appropriate packaging materials that are sized to the shelf, and you also want to create an appropriate storage environment. So that's how you select the type of storage system that you need. We recommend at least these 5 different types of storage area functions at any property room. A temperature controlled storage area, that's 90% of your evidence. A non-evidentiary property storage area, again, that should probably also be temperature controlled, but a separate space away from your evidence that segregates evidence and non-evidence, because hopefully this is evidence that you're getting into and you're disposing of monthly. Cold case storage, which is not the same as cold storage. Cold case storage is evidence that we're not gonna interact with or interface with on a regular basis. So that's evidence we can keep away from the other evidence because it's just going to get in the way if it's stored with our common evidence that we're going to cycle through in a couple of years. Cold storage, both refrigerated and frozen. It's also important to think about temporary submission for frozen or refrigerated samples, and then hazmat or chemical storage. doesn't matter how hard you try as an evidence custodian, someone's going to bring in hazardous materials. We can we can complain about it until the cows come home, but that stuff is going to come in. If it needs to be there, if it's of probative forensic value and it comes in, then we need to be able to safely store it. That's going to require a separate area for hazardous chemicals or hazardous materials, and then an appropriate storage environment for those things. We'll talk more about how to store guns, drugs, money, biological evidence, and high value items a little bit later on. So there is more storage talk to come, and you can thank your stars for that. So here are a couple of pictures. I mean, these are traditional shelves. I mean, I really probably don't need to show you pictures of shelves too much, but high density mobile shelving is, to me, it makes me weep openly. It is the most beautiful thing you will ever see is just rolling shelves that maximize the footprint of your facility, and eliminate wasted space. And those things can be configured a number of different ways. Here's a shelf, traditional shelving with, storage and organization patterns, cold storage, high shelving. These are all just different storage methods, filing cabinets of various sizes and shapes. There are all kinds of ways to store evidence. I'm going to blow through those because everyone's seen a filing cabinet. I don't need to show you a picture of a filing cabinet, but this is something unique. This is a hybrid high density mobile storage unit where you've got shelves and filing cabinets that work in concert with one another. And some of those are even integrated with rack storage, which is pretty cool. If you're a small property room and you've got maybe an evidence room the size of a closet, that space is precious to you. Every cubic inch is precious. So you want to maximize your use of that space as efficiently and effectively as possible. This might be something that can help you achieve that. When I talk about storage, the main thing that I'm concerned about is storage efficiency. Storage efficiency is a function of available space, the size of the package that you select or choose to use to package the item, the method that you use to store it in, a logical order. I mean, all these factors combine to create an efficient storage environment. But the most important thing is we don't store air. That's one of the reasons why I kind of have a soapbox issue relationship with plastic high, with the plastic heat seal tubing, is because those tend to just store air, and they're almost impossible to put in any order or to file because there's no structure. There's no form. Uh, it's not just that I hate them. It's just that they're wrong in oh so many ways. One of the things we want to do is minimize air gaps. You want to eliminate storing air as much as possible. So you can see here, and I'll show you in a diagram. You want to reclaim all the space that you possibly can. This is a picture of a standard shelving unit. Now, it is 8 feet tall. It is 48 inches wide. It is 18 inches deep. We also don't want to go too deep on our shelving because that's just more wasted space, or it's space that we can't really make use of because most items fit in a footprint that's about 18 inches deep. So at its gross capacity, it's got 48 cubic feet of storage space. It's effectively, when you take away the 2 inches on the side and a 2 inch gap at the top of each shelf for a handling gap, it's got 44.5 cubic feet of effective storage. In terms of square footage, you basically multiply the footprint of that storage space. It's got 24 square feet of shelving as presently configured. Now you miss a couple of inches on each side, so 23.5 square feet of shelves effectively is what you have. Now, when you don't use shelves appropriately, you lose efficiency. So our storage efficiency, see that big air gap right there? Because we could have stacked two packages on top of one another. The packages aren't spaced, neatly or to take advantage of the footprint. So we basically were at 60% inefficiency when we underutilize shelving like this. So we're down 60% in cubic storage. We're down 25% in square footage. We've got to reclaim that space because, hey, that's useful space. And when you multiply that out over time, if you do this for 3 shelves, it just magnifies and multiplies your inefficiency. A better solution would be making our shelves more efficient. Now we've achieved by adding 3 shelves to that same standard unit and by changing the way we space and package on that unit, we've gone from 60% inefficiency down to 10%. 10%, you're probably never going to get more efficient than that. And then I got to move a water bottle. Yeah, we're at 10% in terms of our square footage as well. So think about that. When you look at a shelf, don't just look at its beauty or its grace or its elegance. Look at it in terms of how efficiently are we using this space to store evidence? Are we storing air? Are we wasting space that we could be reclaiming? Because every little bit over time makes a difference. So again, you compare, there's 94 square feet on this shelf. I might have done the math wrong there, but 100 versus 164 square feet. All important things to take a look at. We're going to talk about evidence disposition for the remainder of our time. The
Yes.
store discussion went on. We might even kind of extend the evidence disposition discussion into next week, but we'll get through as much as we possibly can here today because this is a topic that's going to impact everyone and it's important. So with that, I don't think we need to go over those. We're not. We're going to skip it. So here are some fun facts about evidence disposition. Right now in your agency, I could make an educated guess. I couldn't win a bet, but I really believe that I could walk into your room and I could tell you that between 50 and 80% of the evidence that you're storing is currently eligible for disposition. I know that anecdotally. I know that, I mean, it's just the case. Unless you're an extremely efficient operation, most of the time we store a lot of evidence that we don't need to keep around. Another number to work with is it takes about 30 minutes to dispose of an item of evidence. When you look at all the different factors involved in evidence disposition, sending a notification, physically disposing of the item, all the documentation, we invest typically about 30 minutes to dispose of that item. Most evidence that was being prepared for disposal, that's the most vulnerable time for theft or misappropriation. So when we're getting rid of evidence, when we're disposing of evidence, that is when evidence is at its most vulnerable for being misappropriated. Another thing that's also been scientifically proven is that efficient disposition of evidence actually lowers blood pressure and reduces hair loss for evidence custodians. I don't know if you knew this, but
Doesn't work.
it is an incontrovertible scientific fact that if you efficiently dispose of evidence, it has health benefits for you as well. So why is disposition such a big deal? Disposition is related to two of the most critical commodities in evidence management. The two things that you are going to need more of as an evidence custodian for time immemorial. You're going to need more space and you're going to need more time. Evidence disposition is directly related to both of those commodities, space and time. The disposition process is pretty much the same for every single item of evidence that comes into your shop. And we'll talk about each of these, but the disposition process, regardless of whether it's for a homicide weapon or for a found property, piece of found property, the process is often going to be very similar. We have to work with eligibility, identification, finding the item, researching the item, making notifications as appropriate, obtaining authorization, and then physically disposing of the item. We're going to see that play out over and over and over again. So when it comes to eligibility, this is really important. Uh, when we The thing that we love to talk about in evidence management is disposing of evidence. That's the thing that makes us the happiest. That's what fills your heart with joy. But evidence disposition is not necessarily the most important part of evidence management. The most important part of evidence management is retaining evidence for the time period that you're supposed to keep it. That is really the most important kind of benchmark for success is, did we keep it as long as we needed it? Did we dispose of it when we could? Eligibility is based on a number of different factors. The time that we're required to retain the item, whether or not the case has been adjudicated, whether or not there are related appeals or that the person is still in custody, almost every state has limitation statutes. Can this case still be filed as a criminal cause in your state if it's on your shelf? For a lot of states, in Texas, misdemeanors are a 2-year proposition, and a lot of other states are 1 year or even 90 days in some cases. So I would find evidence on my shelf on misdemeanor cases that was like 5 years old. Well, they can't even file the case anymore. Those are the types of items that get us in trouble. So the key concept here is retain evidence for the full duration of required custody. Get rid of it as soon as you possibly can. It's retaining the evidence that's important. If we fail to retain evidence, then we deny justice to victims of crime and to people that might be exonerated by that evidence. So it is really important that is the fundamental, the guiding principle is making sure that we retain evidence until we don't have to keep it anymore. And that may seem like an oversimplification, but it is what we do, and this is what allows us to make sure that that evidence is able to achieve its function, especially for victims of crime or for people that might be exonerated or convicted. I mean, evidence is important. What you do is important. The way you store it, the way you dispose of it is important. You've got a lot. Uh, there's a lot involved in that equation that is important to a lot of different people. That's why we keep this stuff. So we keep evidence for the entire duration of custody until we receive approval and authorization to dispose of the item. That's the required duration of custody, again restated. And that duration of custody is going to be contingent on a number of things that we can't get into and we can't possibly kind of adequately cover today. State law, I mean, the limitation statutes kind of govern when you can file a case, or evidence retention statutes. Almost every state in the union, especially for biological evidence, has enacted new legislation related to biological evidence retention. And the reason is because we were pretty bad at it for a while. We've realized the importance and the necessity of retaining that evidence, so states have enacted legislation that compels it. Now, these states aren't always good at writing laws. Uh, I've found that to be true in my neck of the woods, but they are laws nevertheless, and they do definitely impact when we can dispose of evidence. Local policies. Two agencies immediately adjacent to one another might have different policies related to evidence retention. Case status. Has the case been adjudicated? Have all the associated cases or affiliated cases been adjudicated? Have we apprehended or identified all the offenders related to the case? And then sometimes the term of sentence or appeals process for the offender needs to be factored into retaining the evidence as well. And then there additionally there might be judicial authorization that's required to dispose of an item. There's always going to be an investigator process authorization that we need to dispose of evidence. And then the last piece of it is you might not be able to dispose of evidence until you've made appropriate owner notification. And that varies again from state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Retention status. Basically, if it's whether it's in your physical custody or at a temporary facility like a lab or a forensic lab or a secure electronic storage, those are we consider it retained until it's no longer our obligation or our responsibility. So when I use the word retain, what I mean is basically it's evidence that's still under our purview, our custody, our control. It is still our obligation, regardless of where it's located. Um, and again, some states have enacted legislation that requires extending the time for biological evidence. What is in California? I think I've asked this question every time I've been there.
For biological evidence, 10 years for felony, and then obviously, a year and a day for misdemeanor infraction crimes.
Okay, that's great.
Of course, there's a ton of other factors that go along with that, but we'll just go that direction.
But comparing it to the environment that I worked under before I retired, I mean that's doable. I mean that in Texas, and if you're a legislator in the state of Texas, I no, I don't apologize. Who am I gonna? We wrote our biological evidence retention law was like 50 years or 40 years for all felonies that you would keep. And I mean, it's unmanageable. We wrote a law that couldn't possibly be followed. That's another soapbox. But states have also enacted legislation that reduces the retention burden for evidence storage. If you work in a state where photographic evidence of theft is admissible as physical evidence, that's a beautiful thing. Take advantage of that. There are states that permit evidence to be sampled, like bulk narcotics storage or bulk narcotics evidence. I've never seen that. I've never been able to do that successfully. There's still some concerns there with sampling storage for bulk evidence, but the laws exist. Some states even fund remote storage of biological evidence for smaller communities and smaller agencies. There are a lot of things out there. Just know that evidence retention is often impacted by legislation. So when it gets down to identifying, how do we find evidence that's eligible for disposal? There are basically two ways to do that. We can troll through our evidence room and notice big boxes that are old, or we can have automated processes that kind of push that information to us. Obviously, I'm going to be a proponent of an automated process that identifies evidence that is being stored in our system and lets me know when to review this evidence for disposition. That is the only efficient mechanism for identifying evidence. Uh, I have done the other plenty of times. I've walked through my evidence room and looked at big boxes that seemed old and I wonder what case that's related to, and then did the evidence or did the research based on that. But without a system of identifying evidence for disposal, uh, without a ability to identify that stuff, you're not going to have an effective or efficient disposal system. It can't happen. Then the research process. The research process is important, and there are a lot of agencies in a lot of different areas of the country where this is entirely a function of evidence managers and evidence custodians. We will talk about changing that, especially in uh, the next few slides. I believe that all evidence submitting officers should know and be trained in how to research cases to determine whether or not they're adjudicated or eligible for disposition. But that requires training people how to research adjudications, how to research and know definitively what limitation statutes require, uh, administrative policies and different things that are required for evidence disposition. Those have to be spelled out, and we need to train people in those areas. Our eligibility requirements for evidence should be established in policy and procedure, and we should be able to point back to that procedure to point us to how we determine whether or not an item is eligible or not. It can't be something that we just kind of create uh, by practice. Generally, the research involves pretty complex investigations into case adjudication, identification of suspects, all the laws, evidence retention laws. It's a really complex process. So we've got to start training people how to do that and writing down in a procedure and providing training to officers on eligibility research. It will magnify your efforts in the future significantly and make your evidence operations much more efficient. I've added two documents at the bottom of your screen under handouts. These are just samples. These are just things that you can use. One of them is an evidence disposal procedure that walks through specific procedures for disposing of evidence at an imaginary police department, Lower Cletusville Police Department. Don't know what state it's in, doesn't matter. But there's a sample policy there that will walk you through what they do in Lower Cletusville for disposing of evidence. And there's also a research guide that will teach you how to basically the purpose of this guide was to teach officers how to research disposition eligibility. It's a very specific guide. Hopefully you can use it as a baseline document that might help answer some questions for you. Um, So notification, and this presumes that, and this might be kind of cart before the horse, but with respect to the disposition process, there are always some notifications that are going to be required. It's important that we make these notifications expeditiously and appropriately. That includes the officer that is related to the case. Sometimes the courts need to be notified of our intent to destroy evidence. The owner of that property item. That's one of the things that we that we often kind of leave out of the disposition process is this belongs to someone. This piece of property belongs to someone. There's usually an owner that this stuff should go back to. It's not always possible to find or identify that, but we need to make appropriate notifications as a part of our disposition process. And again, it's not the notification necessarily that's critical, it's getting a response. When you send an email to an officer, hey, this is case 2015 456. Can I get rid of this evidence? It's not making the notification that's important, it's getting the response. And that's something that we will discuss at length uh, here in the next couple of slides. So, with respect to notifications, it's usually going to be the evidence manager's responsibility to notify investigators that there is evidence that we need to review or research for disposition. The best way for this to happen is an automated process. I would love to discuss automated processes. We've discussed it previously, but this is where automation really benefits agencies and makes you more efficient, more effective, and more sustainable. When this process is automated, where those notifications go out automatically based on the case type. If this is a intoxication driving offense, this that we're going to set, that's going to go back to the investigator at a year for review. When that happens automatically and we're not having to send these things out, that multiplies and magnifies our ability to dispose of evidence exponentially. I'm a big believer in tracking notifications and making sure that we add a response deadline for officers because let's face it, sometimes they're not going to respond. And that is a problem. But that is a culture problem. It's not necessarily a problem with our disposition process. It's something that we need to change in our agency culture. Getting them to respond to those notifications is something that we need to figure out. My recommendation, if you've got an agency where the culture of the practice is to not respond to notifications about evidence, you got to escalate that up the chain. And you've got to escalate it up the chain and document that process until you get an appropriate response. It is really helpful if that initial documentation, that initial notification that goes out, you got to provide clear instructions for the officers. You've got to document those responses. If it's unambiguous, if it makes perfect sense to the officer what you're asking them to do, that's going to go a long ways. You will get better returns and results or rates for your responses than you would if it's just, hey, can I get rid of this stuff? That's very ambiguous. Officers don't feel comfortable making that decision. But when you provide them good information and you provide them a specific question that is binary that they can respond to, sometimes that helps and facilitates better responses from officers. At minimum, you should document the date for the review or a follow-up notification, and then whether or not they approve that item for being disposed of. It's a good practice to have as part of your procedure for notifying officers about dispositions is if they want to keep the stuff, some investigators, no, we have to keep that. Well, at some point, we have to justify why we keep those things. So I recommend a supervisory authorization requirement if officers just want to continue to retain evidence because they're thinking that they might have, uncovered one of the mysteries of human civilization, which is usually not the case. It is 3 o'clock. I think what we will do, because in order to do justice to this topic, and you help me, James, I think
Yeah.
this is something we need to split out. I would rather spend more time on evidence disposition next week than just end the conversation here or speed through the next few slides. Like this, fortunately, we have the ability to be a little more flexible because we just can. So we'll hit this discussion next week and finish up and wrap up dispositions. So that's going to be the end of where we discussed today. If you have questions about evidence storage or this part of the evidence disposition process, we would love to hear them. Let me see if there are any questions.
Yeah, I've been answering them as we go. So I think there's only a couple here. If I can find anything. Okay, Derek Curtis asks, evidence from a retail theft. Do you return to the store even if they've received restitution? That's a good one, Derek. I mean, when we're dealing with private owners, you look at if the insurance company has already paid them out and so forth. Restitution, that may differ from court systems from state to state. Sean, do you have any suggestions on how to handle that?
Here's what I would generally counsel people to do, and obviously there might be some wrinkles with state legislation, but if it's property that belongs to a store, whether or not they've been paid back by an insurer or any other entity out there, the one thing we know is it doesn't belong to you. And, if we don't return it to someone, then it goes in the trash. And if it's useful property, like I know a few big box retailers never seem to want property back. I mean, you could have just recovered, $100,000 of property from, I'll just Walmart. Let's just say we'll use Walmart as an example. A lot of times they don't want that property back, or there's no one. Their loss prevention guy certainly doesn't want it back. So
Maybe
they'll
the
kind of
technology has gone out of date during the time that it was sitting in your
right in the 3 weeks, yeah, that you've recovered it. But
right.
but we know that we don't need to keep it and we don't need to throw it away, and it's really appropriate to give it away or to resell it on our own. So my guidance, my suggestion would be give it back to them. We don't care about whether or not there's been restitution from an insurance company. Let them fight that with that's a civil process that we don't need to be in the middle of. Hey, we got this, you take it back because we don't need it anymore as evidence.
I
So
get official documents sometimes from insurance companies that says that they've paid a claim already, and in the event that, and usually they have our case number, in the event that that becomes available, that property becomes available, they'd like to be notified. That's kind of a relatively new thing that we've just started seeing in the last 5 years or so. So we've actually had to jump on top of that and create a working file to handle those types of requests. So you may see some of those in the future too.
definitely. And a question about a national company that does weapons disposals. I think you were mentioning LSC, and they're out of Las
LSC.
Vegas.
Right, and Gunbusters was also mentioned as well. Gunbusters, I believe they're out of Missouri, and they'll destroy the guns and provide video documentation for you as well.
Yeah, and both of those are national companies that basically provide a very similar function. Let's see. You find any more? Have you answered all these, James?
We're getting some new ones in here now.
I see one question about session handouts.
Yeah.
The previous session handouts are available on our website at evidencemanagement.com. You do have to log into the client site, which is up in the right-hand corner. That's just where I keep documentation that I don't want to put out there on the forward front-facing part of our website. So log in there and you can get those documents. And you see anything else?
Yeah, recommendations for ammo destruction. We used to pay a ton of money to a company called Timberline to get rid of stuff. I think I addressed this yesterday on the webinar too. A lot of it now goes to either our bomb disposal folks or we take it to the range and they shoot it up. So different things. Ammo is kind of a touchy situation because just the nature of what it is. But yeah, I don't foresee paying someone to get rid of your ammo when ammo is so expensive these days, especially in California.
And I know that for our agency in Texas, we used to just shoot up everything that came in. We would give it to the range, and if you got your off-duty gun, we would use that for all kinds of weapons quals. We had a few incidents where there were some reloads or some evidence that maybe or some ammo that was not in optimal condition that caused a few misfires
Yeah.
and stovepipes. So we've shied away from using that. But if your agency is comfortable with that, if your range master and your firearms instructor cadre is comfortable with using that, have a ball. We didn't do that. And got a couple of questions about storage systems. I would love to talk about that offline as far as storage cabinets out there or storage systems that make a lot of sense. Of a small, and you can see that I move my lips and read out loud when I'm
Pretty good.
asked. A small college fridge for a cold storage, what we would recommend officers putting evidence in. And you can tell that I have difficulty reading, speaking,
Yeah.
and looking at things at the same time. But I think the question is, what kind of cold storage do we recommend? And I don't make a specific product recommendation for cold storage, but I will say that if you're going to have a cold storage system, generally consumer products are not appropriate sources for cold storage because
Right.
they don't regulate humidity and they don't regulate, well, they regulate temperature fairly well. But a cold storage system that's designed for evidence, is it more expensive? Yes, it is. But
Hmm.
it'll achieve a couple of things for you. It will appropriately store that evidence, and it will also, usually the good ones have alarms on them that will let you know if the temperature or humidity drops below
Good
tolerance.
point.
It will provide an alert or an alarm. Uh, Most consumer products just don't do that. I
Yeah.
know that there are a lot of evidence companies, lab companies. If I were to point you in a direction, where would I go to find a cold storage system? Uh, First, I would consult your crime lab and see what products they use. But any lab, any scientific lab supply company is going to have cold storage devices in their catalog. Just look at the features. Look for humidity control and temperature control, and then temperature alarms and humidity alarms. Those are three features that you want in your cold storage system.
Cool.
And I have a question about a refrigerator with a lock. This property technician is the only one with a key. Uh, where should officers put evidence? I mean, without trying to sound flippant, I would try to figure out another system, because if you're the only one that has a key to the only appropriate way to store evidence, there's two options. Either they call you back 24/7 and you're
Yeah.
at their beck and call, or we provide another method for storage and organization. I'm a huge believer and I love key control systems. There are a couple of them out there that basically you can provide those keys, you can provide access to those keys 24/7, and you can control who can access which keys and when they can access. It records their access and provides access to them. Uh, that saves a lot of on-call time and return time back to the facility for your agency. I mean, a lot of times you can justify it in that alone, the cost of one of those key control systems, just based on call time. So,
Sorry about that, Sean. I'm just responding as well online, but good to go.
all right. Well, next week we will wrap up evidence dispositions. We ended talking about authorizations. I know that there are probably going to be some questions related to how do you get officers to respond to disposal notifications. We'll talk about that next week, because I think I can make a compelling business argument that will resonate with chief executives and get them on board with the disposition
Sure.
authorization process. And that's really who you have to have as your advocate. You've got to have higher level, you know, executives at your agency behind you, and we've got a plan for that. So we'll discuss it next week, maybe to
All
keep you
right.
coming back. All right, thank you for being here. I know that a lot of people have dropped off. That was bonus footage. We will finish up dispositions next week. Thank you, James. And
And I apologize if I didn't get to your question. See, there's a few still left, but hopefully we can address a lot of these next week with dispositions.
Yeah, and feel free to email me or email James. We would both be happy to answer your questions. Uh, there's one last question, and there's two. You do realize that we can't see all the questions,
Yeah,
so we don't know
there's
what's
not
being.
a really good dashboard. It's not the best to try and open it up and look at all the questions. So we may have missed a couple.
Well, then Teresa, we actually answered all the questions, 100%. I can say that
Good
to
man.
Teresa because I know her. Do I have a sample disposition request? I don't. Uh, I don't, and I wouldn't make a paper form request, but I can